I teach here at the Kennedy School, and I direct our Environment and Natural Resource Program, and it's a great pleasure for me tonight to introduce our speaker. And I say this for three reasons. First, Douglas LaFollette is an academic who has made good. After getting a PhD in organic chemistry, a subject many of us avoided at all costs when we were in college, from Columbia, and serving as an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin and obtaining numerous honors for academic excellence, he entered the political field and has served 5 times as Wisconsin's Secretary of State. I was thinking today that you ran your first race before most of our undergraduates were ever born. He has been chairman of the Board of Commissioners for Public Lands in the state of Wisconsin for 7 years. He helped organize the first Earth Day in 1970 and the 20th anniversary Earth Day in 1990. He is an author of the Survival Handbook, a strategy for saving the planet Earth. And his record is, as one of the real leaders in the United States, and particularly in the Midwest, is unquestionable. The second and the third reason come from the fact that, first, he comes from the state of Wisconsin, and anybody who follows sort of progressive action, be it environment or be it an area that I worked a lot in, energy, knows that Wisconsin for almost 50 years has been on the cutting edge of progressive thinking in America. And Douglas LaFollette is a continuation of this tradition. The third reason is that next Wednesday will be the 28th Earth Day. And it comes at a time when the nations of the world have agreed to tackle the most difficult and challenging issue of climate change. It is as if in the environment area we have been practicing climbing on the Berkshires and have now been told that we must tackle Mount Everest. And the issue of climate change is not going to be easily resolved or resolved at all unless we resolve the even bigger issue, and that is the issue of population growth. As more and more people have come to the conclusion that our present rate of growth is unsustainable. To meet these problems, we must learn from the lessons of the past and have the vision to meet the challenges of the future. And Douglas LaFollette is a person uniquely equipped to fill these two tasks this evening. Douglas?
Thank you. Thank you very much. My little microphone is working, I can tell, so you can hear me. It's a very great honor to be here and to talk with you about the subjects that I'm interested in. I always have trouble knowing what to talk about because if you work in this field and have for a number of years, there's so many things going on in the environmental, political, energy arena that I feel overwhelmed by a lot of it, and I don't know what to start out with. Thank you for the introduction, and it inspires me to sort of start out by skipping to the end of my talk and saying that it's interesting to note that the agreements that we made on a voluntary basis to limit greenhouse gases under President Bush back in the 1990s, we didn't meet those, of course, and we went way beyond them. But the interesting little fact is that even if we would have met them in terms of the per capita emission, the population growth of the United States in that intervening time would have offset the gains we made. So even if we would have done what we said we would do, which we didn't at all, it would have been overwhelmed by the population growth in this country in that interim period, which kind of sets a real perspective to what Dr. Lee said in terms of the problem of population relating to the global warming issue. My concern and why I'm talking about population here today at Harvard and the JFK School is that no one will talk about it. When I was invited by the Student Environmental Group to participate in the Earth Day celebration here at Harvard, I was very pleased, and I thought about giving a standard environmental talk of one kind or the other. I'm going to do a little bit of that today, just because we should be somewhat respectful to Earth Day. But I decided that if someplace you've got to start talking about taboo things, and population is a taboo. It has been for a number of years, and I'm going to give you some history about that tonight. So I hope that me doing this at Harvard may be a starting point. I wish there were 300 or 400 people here clamoring to hear about it, not because I need a big audience. I'm used to driving hundreds of miles to talk to 4 people. If you're a statewide elected official in northern Wisconsin, sometimes you know about that. But because it would be symbolic that people at Harvard at least were willing to get their head out of the sand and talk about an issue that is so important to our future and yet so undiscussed. All you've got to do is just be a newspaper reader, and I tend to do that to an extent. Here's an article from a week or so ago in a paper in Milwaukee that says lake habitat being destroyed. That's northern Wisconsin's beautiful lakes, kind of like northern New York and other places close to here. And the whole article doesn't mention population. But it's clear if you read that it's being destroyed by a, quote, building boom in northern Wisconsin. Well, who builds houses? Of course, people. Then on the airplane just now, and I just got off that airplane approximately an hour ago, so I really arrived here quickly. There's a very big full-page article in the Christian Science Monitor of 2 days ago that says in the United States, 29% of the plant species are on the edge of extinction, very much endangered. 29% of the plant species of the United States are in danger. There's no mention of population in the whole article. But who do you think is pushing those plants to extinction? It's, of course, people. So with that sort of impromptu in beginning into where I'm going, let me give you a little history about population in the United States and environment. If I had a blackboard, I'd write some things down, but I'm going to make you do some work. Those of you that are taking notes, every so often I'm going to mention a year and a population number. And I was going to put them on a little graph, but you can do it for me on your own little graph. So with a little history, if you go back to, say, before we kept track of things, we could say that the world had somewhere around 800 or so million people, maybe. By 1600, which is pretty recent, there were approximately 500 million. So 500 million in the year 1600. By the year 1800, there were 1 billion people. Before 1950, in this country where we live and where I grew up, we didn't talk about the environment hardly at all. It was sort of a non-existent subject before 1950. And that's about when there began to be some embryonic discussion about environment. And in 1950, there were 2.5 billion people. So put that one down. Now, something happened in this country between 1950 and 1970 that I feel was very key to bringing about the beginnings of the modern environmental movement in this country, which most people would say started about 1970. Between 1950 and 1970, the real income of the average American doubled. That's after taxes and inflation. I mean, a tremendous amount of wealth on a large number of people. Never before in history were there that many people around, but also who became that rich that quickly. It was the post-World War II consumer technological TV sets, automobiles, etc. revolution, if you will. And I symbolize that 20-year period as unregulated breakneck growth. Well, by the late 60s, we entered what I have defined in some of my work as the first stage of the modern environmental movement. Things got so bad that we could begin to smell it and taste it. I call it the big chunks, because there literally were big chunks. If you went to the pipe coming out of the local factory, green, yellow globs of stuff was being discharged. There was a power plant about 20 miles from where I was living, where I was teaching at the university at that time in Wisconsin, where literally black smoke poured out most of the time. This was 1969's area. So it got bad enough that we could taste it, we could smell it. And people began to say, wait a minute. And that was the beginning of the modern environmental movement, the big chunks period. The famous stories of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland that caught fire. 26 people died one day in Pittsburgh when there was an air inversion in the very polluted coal and steel industries of Pittsburgh in that period of time. Something began to happen. The Fox River in Wisconsin literally had no fish left in it. Well, to understand the environment in a thorough way, you need to analyze it in great depth. And I taught a whole course that lasted one semester on this subject, so you're going to get a very quick overview. You can summarize it by what has been described by many as the IPAT equation. If I had we don't have a blackboard here that's easy to get to, and it's probably not worth bringing one down, but the IPAT equation is I equals PAT. He's going to have me push one of these buttons, but it's not that critical. Did this actually happen? Or did it just pull it up? Oh, here we go. Is that a blackboard? Okay. Well, that's the whole thing. If you understand that, you get a PhD from Harvard in environmental science. That's it. Because this is the impact on the environment is a product of three interacting factors: the population, affluence, and technology. And you can structure your entire course around that, and I have taught such a course, and many of you have studied them here at Harvard. To discuss this in some superficial detail here tonight, let me talk about technology first and work our way backwards. Technology is where we analyze which things we need and want and what method we use to obtain them, and then how that impacts the environment. And there are all kinds of examples. The story I often use when I talk to a junior high school class or a high school class is I tell them the apple story. I often say to people, do you think apples cause pollution? And not many people raise their hand. I say, no, they do. Apples cause pollution. Do I want to ban apples to save the environment? No, I love apples. I eat them a lot. But the question about apples is how much impact those apples are going to have on the environment. And to look at the technological issue, the simplest example is to say, if you have an apple for supper tonight here in Cambridge, and that apple came from, say, Oregon or Wisconsin, did it come here to Cambridge by truck or by train? The apples tasted the same, provided the same enjoyment and benefit to you, but if it came by truck, it caused 6 times more air pollution and used 6 times more fossil fuel than it would have if it came by train. So there's a technological decision which impacts the environment greatly, but most people who buy apples never even think about. There are many other things we could talk about. Was the apple grown organically, or was it grown with pesticides, which would cause a tremendous influence on toxic issues of groundwater, etc. We can talk about other technologies like, let's say you had a banana to go with your apple. And when you got through with the banana, what'd you do with the peel? Well, most Americans do what with banana peels? They drop them in the sink and go and run about 2 gallons of water, mix up a banana peel and ship it to the sewage treatment plant. That's an environmental disaster. I call garbage disposals water pollution machines. That's all they do is take clean, purified water that your taxpayer had to pay to clean up and chlorinate it. It mixes it with a banana peel that you grind up with a machine that costs a lot to produce in terms of copper and metal, and then you ship it off to the nearest stream or river and dump it. You're basically dumping eutrophic material, fertilizer, into the lake. What should you do with a banana peel? You should compost it. Here again, a technological choice. Do we compost our organic waste, or do we grind it up and dump it in the Charles River? A technological decision which has a tremendous impact based on how you make that decision. We could talk at great length on paper versus plastic. I used to have students write papers on that. When you go to the grocery store and they say paper or plastic, which do you choose? Well, you pull out your cloth bag and say, I'll pack my own. But most people choose plastic or paper. Which is better for the environment? Technological decisions impacting the environment. I could go on a lot. One of the most famous ones that I chose to end up with because of the talk tonight is, do you use cloth diapers or Pampers on your one child that you and your spouse decide to have? Or the second one that you adopt? Cloth versus Pampers. There have been reports, literally half an inch thick, written on that issue, analyzing what kind of paper, were the trees clear-cut, was the paper made with chlorination process or oxygenation process, was the paper bleached, what kind of plastic, can you recycle Pampers or not, and on and on. That isn't the topic tonight, so we won't do that. That would be a good topic for a technological environmental engineering course here at Harvard. So that's the T. Now we go to the affluence section. Well, I'm going to spend the least time on that, although the truth of the matter is probably the most important issue for this country, because we are literally pigs when it comes to our environmental consumption and discharge. The average American probably has more impact than 30, 40, 50 Homo sapiens living in any other variety of countries in the world other than Western Europe, Japan, and Canada, for example. So the level of how many apples do you eat? Do you eat 1 apple or 10 apples? Because obviously the more apples you eat, the more impact you have. And apples are pretty harmless. But when you get to living in homes in this country that now are getting up to 3,000, 4,000 square foot homes, 3-car garages are now becoming normal for new homes with 2 or 3 kitchens and 4 or 5 bathrooms, on and on. That level of affluence has a tremendous impact on the environment, and it's far above what any rational human being could call necessary. Well, finally, as we work our way down, we get to P, the population. And that, of course, is very serious. By the time we, and Gaylord Nelson, senator from Wisconsin, who you're going to hear from later in a little video I have, he was my U.S. senator in 1970, and he and a number of students at the University of Wisconsin concocted the idea of a giant national teach-in, which became Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. At that date, the population, write this one down, 1970, was 3.8 billion people. I gave many talks in which I wrote that down, 3.8 billion, and going up at 2 per second, every second 2 more people. That was 1970, the first Earth Day. Well, I'm going to leave the environment behind now with that brief introduction. I did bring along a few copies of the book that I wrote on the environment. There's a chapter in here on solid waste, on air, water, new energy, etc. If any of you want a copy, I've got some up here. But I'm now going to go on to the P of the IPAT equation, which is, in fact, I think, the most important issue. Earth Day happened in large part because of the big chunks, the things we could smell and taste. And some good things happened. We shouldn't put aside the fact that there was progress in some areas. Most politicians learned to pronounce the word environment. I'm not sure they learned to do much about it, but they learned to pronounce it. And along with the standard, cut your taxes, apple pie type of speech, most of them threw in the word environment. We had some good policy decisions. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Dangerous Species Act, the setting up of the whole process of the EPA and environmental impact statements all happened in the early 70s, middle 70s. And we made some progress. Fish came back to the Fox River. The black smoke no longer comes out of our smokestacks. But here's the hooker. In the Fox River, and most everywhere else in this country, you can't eat the fish. Wisconsin has a fish advisory for 90% of all the streams and lakes in Wisconsin because the level of mercury and PCBs and other chemicals in those fish is unsafe for a pregnant woman for sure, or young people, or anybody else to eat more than once a month or something like that. But no longer does black smoke come out of the smokestacks, but what's coming out of those smokestacks that we can't see and never even thought about in 1970? Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, etc. So the big chunks are gone, the black smoke is gone, and we move into the second stage of the modern environmental movement. This is now sometime in sort of the middle 80s, I'd say. I call that the "it ain't as easy as we thought it was going to be" stage. Kind of a long title, but pretty descriptive. It ain't as easy as we thought it was going to be. And many of us who helped do these kind of things in the late 60s and 70s never envisioned it. I started an environmental group, which is still functioning, in 1971. And I and the other men and women who helped me do it, we called it Wisconsin's Environmental Decade. Because we naively really believed that 10 years would take care of it. We'd pass good laws, we'd get environmental education, we'd all understand the reality of it, and by 1985 we could go hiking and not worry about it. Well, then we came to the "it ain't as easy as we thought it was going to be" stage. And we learned that political band-aids and ineffective regulatory actions, all these laws we passed that were now being implemented by the EPAs and the State Department of Natural Resources around the country, were being overwhelmed by lobbyists and special interests, etc. Namely, we learned, and I guess the legacy of the late 1980s was that we had hoped for painless solutions to systemic problems. And it doesn't work. You don't solve systemic problems with Band-Aids and painless solutions. So what do we then face? We faced a whole list of very complex environmental issues, much more difficult than the black smoke. And I'll just make a list of them for you. Ozone depletion, acid rain, soil erosion, toxic materials of a variety of types in the groundwater, in our food. A new book by a friend of mine I recommend to all of you, it's now a couple years old, I guess, called Our Stolen Future by a woman named Dr. Theo Colburn. She got her PhD at age about 55, and now she's close to 70, and she's all over the world giving speeches on the effect of chlorohydrocarbons on endocrine disruption in animals and humans all over the world. She's sort of the Rachel Carson of today. It's an excellent book, Our Stolen Future by Dr. Theo Colburn. Global warming, or what I prefer to call climate change, because too many people in Wisconsin think a little global warming would be a good thing in January. I think climate change is a safer thing to talk about, because as you probably know now, and we didn't know this a few years ago, global climate change means it'll get warmer some places and colder others, drier some, wetter others. It isn't just a matter of global warming. It's much more complicated than that. Deforestation, destruction of wetlands, extinction of species, like I mentioned with the 26% of plants in the United States, and of course, population. Because by 1990, after 20 years of Earth days, the population had got up to 5.3 billion. So we went from 3.8 to 5.3, and worse, it was going up at 3 per second. By 1990, when we had the 20-year celebration, it was 3 per second, when back in 1970 it was 2 per second. And today, just to add to your little graph, we're now up to about 5.8 billion people. A good friend of mine and a very remarkable scholar at Cornell University named David Pimentel and a group of other scientists did a study a few years ago as to what the carrying capacity of the Earth would be in terms of the number of people. And after several years, they came up with the shocking and almost they were afraid to publish it, conclusion that the world could probably support about 2 billion people if we were to reduce our consumption level, the A and the T, back to a level of about 1950 US, or about half of the current per capita consumption, approximately what Western Europe is today. So if we lived at the consumption level of Western Europe, everyone in the world, we could support about 2 billion people sustainably. Well, we're already at 5.8, and it's kind of interesting. So what happened then? Well, what happened from my experience is that in the 1990s, let's say, the political elites and the corporate elites in this country began to get nervous because they saw that dealing with these more complex issues like climate change and species extinction and soil erosion, etc., were not conducive to quick fix solutions. And in fact, they would require fundamental changes in the way we do things. And those fundamental changes begin to become obvious to politicians and the leaders of the corporate America were going to be expensive. And they were going to possibly cut into their short-term profit margins, not to mention their re-election capabilities or their ability to raise money from special interest groups like the oil industry, the chemical industry, the logging industry, etc., who support most of our politicians. So now, today, in the last few years, we've been in what I call the third stage of the modern environmental movement, the backlash. And we're in one. There's no question about it. We're clearly in a backlash. You can see it in many fronts. You can see it in the current Congress in Washington. And this backlash is not accidental. There have been people who have studied this and written about it, and they can pretty much show that it was a well thought out and organized plan. I don't believe in necessarily, conspiracy theories. I don't think it was a conspiracy. I think it was just a major effort on the part of a number of individuals and organizations. And I'll just make you a list of the symbols of this, because it's not my main topic here tonight. Big business organized a misinformation campaign, clearly. And they have and are spending, just in relating to the Kyoto conference. There was somewhere in the area of $20 million or more dollars spent during that week or so of Kyoto by the oil industry and auto industry poo-pooing the problems of climate change on television, except in this country. Because of that, the American public, if you do polling, indicates that they're not totally convinced that climate change is the problem, where Europeans are 90% concerned about it because they didn't have the big corporate misinformation campaign to distract the public of Europe the way the American public was distracted. These same interests set up think tanks. These are think tanks which publish non-peer-reviewed pseudo-scientific material that looks really good. I mean, I just brought a few samples. These come to me. This is the Harlan Institute, A Candidate's Guide to Environmental Issues. I got this last year. No, I'm sorry, 2 years ago. Earth Day 1996. A very slick color brochure with all kinds of articles by people like Fred Singer, PhD, about there is no problem of ozone, etc. The Environmental News comes out once a month. The Climate Treaty puts U.S. in a no-win situation, blah, 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 on global warming. And an environmental briefing book by the Competitive Enterprise Institute for candidates who want to run for office on each issue and how they should take a position on it. There are literally dozens of these organizations, well-funded, ranging from the Cato Institute, the Harlan Foundation, the famous Free Enterprise Institute, and many of those. They have tremendous amounts of money. And every few weeks, a new one pops up called the Association for Clean Air. And you discover who it really is the auto industry and the oil industry, et cetera. So that's been a very serious problem we face, and it's getting worse. The loss of community in our nation. We no longer have small communities where we can relate to each other, and that makes it much more difficult to bring together a societal effort in favor of doing things that would be good for the community versus the individual benefit of an individual or a corporation. The radio talk show led by Rush Limbaugh, et cetera, have been a major impact. The wise youth movement in general, with their tremendous amount of money they put into this effort. I urge you to look at a book by Paul Ehrlich, who I'm going to mention in a minute, with another famous book he wrote. He wrote a book recently called The Betrayal of Science and Reason, an excellent documentation of what I've been talking about, the misuse of science by these well-funded interests, the betrayal of science and reason. And finally, campaign financing. We no longer live in a democracy. We live in a dollarocracy. We all read about it continuously. How many millions of dollars a man or woman has to have to run for Congress or U.S. Senate? That money doesn't come from John and Sally Public writing $25 checks. It comes from millions of dollars from these same interests who don't like to hear about the environmental movement. Well, nowhere is that backlash more obvious than in the P of the equation. The famous warnings of Malthus have been ignored and poo-pooed for many years. In 1968, Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich, who I just mentioned with his new book, wrote a best-selling book called The Population Bomb. And that book, combined with the growing pollution I described a minute ago, were in large part responsible for the modern environmental movement and the Earth Day that I talked about. Now, if you want to make another chart here, and maybe now that I have a blackboard, I'll put this one up here for you. In 1492, people estimate that there were around 1 million people in North America. That's pretty much a rough estimate, obviously. By 1750, there were 1 million, let's say, Europeans. By 1790, there were 4 million. By 1850, 23 million. By 1900, 76 million. And by 1950, 151 million. Okay? Oh, that's fine, thank you. So that gives you a little perspective on the population here in the United States over a fairly short period, bringing us again up to 1950, when I sort of start the idea of a modern environmental movement. Now, the first serious attempt to talk about population was in Chicago in June of 1970, in connection with the first Earth Day kind of ideas. Because if we want to continue our little chart here, by that 1970 period, we were 200 million. And it was called the First National Congress on Optimum Population and Environment, or COPE, and it was a big deal. It lasted for approximately 5 days, and it was a bringing together of environmental people, minority community, religious groups, all discussing what had become so obvious in 1970, that we had a problem. They came up with a lot of good ideas, but the truth matter, it never really caught on a whole lot in the area of population. In March of 1970, I'm going to go through a chronology now, so get ready for a bunch of dates. In March of 1970, President Nixon established the Commission on Population Growth and the American Future, an extremely famous and important act that I doubt if anyone ever heard of that here? It became known as the Rockefeller Commission because he appointed Lawrence Rockefeller to chair it. In May of 1972, after 2 years of hearings and deliberations all across this country, the Rockefeller Commission released its report, and I'll just quote a couple of quotes from it. To make population and all it means explicit on the national agenda, to signal its impact on our national life, to sort out the issues and propose how we start towards a better state of affairs, by very nature, population is a continuing concern and should receive continuing attention. Moreover, the Commission concluded that, quote, in the long run, no substantial benefit will result from further growth of this nation's population. Rather, the gradual stabilization of our population through voluntary means would significantly signify ability of this nation to solve its problems. That was in 1972. No further growth would benefit this country. The Rockefeller Commission contained 70 extremely good recommendations. The Commission report fell on deaf ears. Why? Mostly because Nixon rejected it publicly. As you may remember, he was in some political hot water approximately then, and he faced re-election six months later. He needed to get the Catholic vote in order to get reelected. President Nixon even sent a letter to Cardinal Terence Cook of New York in which he publicly disavowed the Rockefeller Commission. When asked in June of 1973, someone asked Lawrence Rockefeller why the Commission's recommendations had not gone anywhere, and he said, quote, the greatest difficulty has been the active opposition of the Roman Catholic Church through its various agencies in the United States, unquote. By 1974, after being reelected, President Nixon undertook a comprehensive study which was called the National Security Study Memorandum 200, or short NSSM 200. It was to study population growth and its implications for the United States in regard to environmental concerns and national security. The U.S. contributed much of that report's interest to the Bucharest Convention, which was held in 1974, the first international discussion of population in Bucharest. U.S. Caspar Weinberger was the U.S. representative representing this country. The U.S. signed that document. In December of 1974, the completed report was given to then President Ford. We had a change, remember? And that report said things like this: world population growth is widely recognized within the government as a current danger of the highest magnitude. We should be warned that we must move as rapidly as possible towards stabilizing our national population. Population is already more serious and less amenable than solutions through voluntary means are generally accepted. This is a U.S. government report, not some radical thing done by the Sierra Club, understand. The report was revised and finally made public by President Ford in November of '75. Shortly thereafter, it was never printed, and it was classified for 14 years until it was released again. By 1984, the UN had its second conference on population in Mexico City. Again, we signed that document. In 1993, the National Academies of Science of 58 countries met in New Delhi to discuss population. And these 58 academies of science came to the following conclusion. three conclusions. One was that population was clearly the most urgent problem facing the world. The second conclusion was that it was both a social and political problem. And finally, the National Academy of Sciences concluded that population growth and the increased use of resources was too rapid for science and technology to rescue society from overpopulation. Namely, we can't get our way around this by more science and more technology. These are 58 academies of science from all over the world. The U.S. National Academy signed that document. In June of '94, a presidential decision directive on population, a so-called PDD, was prepared for President Clinton by the National Security Council with the help of the State Department, the Health and Social Service Department, AID, and EPA. The draft of that report to President Clinton said, quote, "Rapid population growth is an urgent and substantial threat to international security and America's ability to have sustainable development." That report disappeared and was never issued. In September of 1994, the third UN Conference on Population met in Cairo. 180 countries signed a plan of action. The U.S. agreed to those terms, but has to date never developed any plan to deal with it. By this time now, 1995, just to keep our chart up here, 1995, after all this fussing around, we're now up to 260 million people. And in 1995, President Clinton appointed a Council on Sustainable Development, which was supposed to look at a strategy for sustainable development in the United States. This was a result of the 1992 Cairo Conference and our response to it. That report acknowledged that there was a strong relationship between population growth and sustainable development and declared the U.S. must move towards stabilizing the U.S. population. The PCSD failed to set a timetable, failed to form any plan, and there's been nothing done about that report since. So, 30 years of avoiding U.S. population. The question I guess we need to ask here tonight is why? Several researchers have concluded that the Vatican and the leadership of the Catholic Church in the U.S. has played a major role in ignoring that. They have done a lot to influence presidents and Congress, the media, and even played a major role in organizing the right-wing Protestant Christian coalition, was funded in large part by the Catholic Church. A number of authors have written things about that. An excellent book just came out not too long ago called The Life and Death of NSSM 200. That was the report I just talked about that was classified. So why was that happen? This is a journal article by that same author about the book, another article about that book, and then some material about that book. I don't have time tonight to go into details. This book that he has written is about 200 pages thick and is footnoted and documented extensively of what happened to the Rockefeller Commission and what happened B, to the NSSM 200 document that was prepared for President Nixon and President Ford. Well, the current population of the U.S. is going up at about 1%. That's 3 times faster than the average developed country. We are growing at 10 times faster than Europe. We are growing more rapidly than some developing countries like South Korea, Singapore, Jamaica, and Hungary. The U.S. population doubled in the last 60 years, and at the current rate, we will double again to about 540 within the next 70 years, and as much as 1 billion by the 21st century. Just for fun, I'll get ready here for something in a minute. So those numbers are pretty scary. That can you imagine in the place where you live, be it Cambridge or your homes in Ohio or California, will they be better places to live with a happier lifestyle for you and your families and friends when it's twice as big? Can you imagine Boston twice as big? Or Chicago twice as big? Or the little town you were born in twice as big? But that's what it'll be in 70 more years at the current rate of growth. And to make it more complicated, the United States has the highest rate of unplanned pregnancies in the industrialized world and the highest rate of teenage pregnancies. 8 out of 10 teenage pregnancies in the United States are unplanned. Well, the manifestations and ramifications of this are numerous, much more than we have time to talk about tonight. But they relate to some key issues. one of them being freedom, our freedom to enjoy a reasonable lifestyle in this country. Few figures from some of David Pimatel's work at Cornell. In the last decade, death from infectious disease has gone up 58% in this country. Overpopulation does cause, along with modern world travel, infectious disease to become worse. We will have less freedom to choose food, recreation, less freedom from air and water pollution, less freedom to find a job where we can live with a lifestyle we find accommodating, less freedom from poverty. Remember, in today's world, of the 5.8 billion people, and in this country, of our 260-some million, there are a lot of very poor people who go to bed hungry and homeless, somewhere around 2 to 3 billion at the world level. Is our ability to deal with the needs of those people going to be made any easier when the population is 2 or 3 times bigger? I think not. Well, put another way, as some authors have said, the U.S. population is an issue not only because of the numbers, but because of our consumption. We have a greater impact than many parts of the world. So now I reach the point in my talk where I say, well, we blew it. I mean, quite honestly, this material I did not make up. This is not an April Fool's speech. These things happened. The Rockefeller Commission happened. All these studies happened. And we, the American public, and our political leaders blew it. We ignored them. Why? It's complicated. It gets to do with a lot of things that I'll talk about in a minute. Certainly, the influence of the church is one major one, and some good documentation about that. So what do? Well, population growth in the United States has to be taken to task by those of us who live here. We cannot lecture to the, quote, rest of the world about all those brown, yellow, and red people who are causing a problem when we have major growth of our own. Not only in terms of the numbers, but in terms of the leadership potential. You can't lead when you are hypocritical. And our lack of a policy definitely shows that hypocrisy. Therefore, I've taken on the task, not only here tonight, but in general, of talking about U.S. population, even though it's not very popular. As I said, at the current rates, U.S. population will be close to 1,000 million people, or 1 billion, by the turn of the century, which we're about to enter. If the recommendations of the Rockefeller Commission would have been followed, estimates are that our population would level off at about 240 million by the year 2035, instead of going to almost a level of twice that. What's it caused by? Well, first is fertility, I mean people having children. And that is full of controversial issues, from birth control, sex education, abortion. I mean, who can think of 3 hotter button issues within one sentence? I, as an elected official who hopes to get reelected this year, this is an election year for me, would never want to utter any of those 3 words in public. Birth control, abortion, sex education. But they are key to a realistic discussion in this country of our fertility. At the moment, for example, Congress, and I just have a thing off the internet from it a few days ago, our current Congress is breaking over each other's necks to try to cut back on Title X funding for family planning clinics in this country, not to mention our jerky attitude towards funding of the United Nations family planning programs around the world, where we have this holier-thou attitude that our money shouldn't go because they don't necessarily agree with all of our politics. So fertility is controversial, despite the fact that every dollar spent on family planning saves $10 in societal costs later on. And every dollar spent on family planning reduces the number of abortions, whether it's this country or the rest of the world. And yet you have people who are making major crusades against abortion who also refuse to fund the family planning clinics, which is a very great hypocrisy. Well, the other major issue that affects us in this country, besides fertility, is immigration. Immigration is also a tremendous hot-button issue, and it's an issue that no one wants to talk about. But here at Harvard, I decided this is a place where you can talk about things that are controversial, so here goes. And rather than talk about it, I'm going to show you a video on immigration, which the folks back there are about ready to turn on, I hope. This is an interesting thing, and as you watch this, watch the numbers. This was done by Gaylord Nelson former U.S. Senator who helped found Earth Day, and I'm proud to say is a friend of mine. And he, along with some other people, and a former journalist, this man named Roy Beck, who you're going to see, he covered environmental journalism for 20 years. And he finally got totally frustrated that every time he mentioned population, it got edited out, and no one ever tied together the global warming or the acid rain or the other problems with population. So he quit his job as a Washington reporter for a major Missouri newspaper and went full-time into the business of researching and writing about population, and he has a presentation that will fit in this as well. So, we'll talk about this in a minute.
Most Americans are fed up with the ever-increasing sprawl and congestion that mar their daily lives. But the natural world fares worse. Wildlife and vegetation are constantly under threat as human development encroaches ever more on the habitats, ecosystems, and biodiversity of the United States. Few regions in America today are safe from the scars of sprawl. There are a number of reasons for all of this. Poor planning, insufficient zoning, careless consumption patterns. But the primary cause is population growth. No matter how well we manage that growth, and it seldom is well managed, it inevitably leads to more sprawl and congestion. For decades, a number of environmental leaders and organizations have recognized this.
As a matter of fact, when I announced the most important challenges that we would face, my Earth Day statement at the time, population was listed, and that's over a quarter of that's 27 or 8 years ago. And it was old hat then to people who were paying attention to what was going on.
The Sierra Club urged that the United States adopt policies to bring about the stabilization of the population, first of the United States and then of the world.
Since Earth Day, the population in this country has increased rather dramatically by some 70-odd million.
One of the people at that time who was concerned with this issue was a young reporter named Roy Beck, one of the first environmental journalists in the country. Since 1991, Roy has been writing books and speaking around the country about the failure of the United States to live up to the population goals of that first Earth Day era. That has meant that Roy has had to tackle the highly sensitive subject of immigration. During the next 60 minutes, you will have the opportunity to see the dramatic, yet careful way Roy has helped audiences across the nation understand the immigration issue. Some environmental groups have begun joining in that explanation, reasserting their leadership in U.S. population issues. The Wilderness Society states that it is a priority to have a population policy that protects ecological systems for future generations. It says that both birth rates and immigration rates need to be reduced. One of the oldest and largest environmental groups, the Isaac Walton League, has said that international migration must be addressed as part of a comprehensive strategy to manage U.S. population size. Those groups were backed in 1996 by President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development. It stated that, quote, reducing immigration levels is a necessary part of population stabilization and the drive towards sustainability, end quote. But most environmentalists have not stepped forward to back up those statements with action. There are fears that asking Congress for reductions in immigration might cause them to be criticized as mean-spirited. That's why so many environmentalists across the country have pooled resources to distribute this tape.
The presentation by Roy Beck that you're about to see is the most dramatic demonstration of the implications of continued population increase and the contribution made to that increase by our huge immigration rate. I think that this issue is the issue of population is the most important environmental issue that we as a nation face.
The key factor in this immigration issue is the numbers. The fact that Americans are concerned about immigration today is not because Americans have suddenly become more mean-spirited or that they've even changed that much. What's changed is the numbers of immigrants. Now listen to these numbers. In the 40 years prior to 1965, we had an average of 178,000 immigrants per year. Now I call that the golden era of immigration because I can find no time in history when immigrants were so welcomed, when they assimilated so quickly, or when they did so well. Because we had lower immigration, we had a tighter labor market, which means that we had the pressure on more capital investment, we had pressure for higher productivity and higher wages. And because of that, we became a middle-class society during that golden era of immigration. And what's really wonderful about the golden era of immigration is that it's the only time in American history that there was a sustained, significant increase in the income of black Americans, and that increase was even faster than the increase for white Americans. Tight labor market's the best friend that any worker ever had. But in 1965, Congress changed the immigration law and inadvertently sent the numbers skyrocketing. Between 1965 and 1989, we averaged more than 500,000 immigrants a year. Nearly every aspect of American society has changed because of that rapid increase. The polls show us that between 70 and 80% of Americans say immigration ought to be cut. And yet, Americans have not really spoken out that much about legal immigration. And I think the reason is because most of us have immigrant friends. We don't want to talk about things that would hurt the feelings of our immigrant friends. And we certainly would not want to say anything or do anything that would bring hostility toward the foreign-born among us. The polls show that Americans believe that immigrants are hardworking, family-loving people. They like immigrants. So what we have right now is a country in which Americans are pro-immigrant but anti-immigration. I find that people get angry when they see what I'm about to show you. And what I ask people, and I ask you, is if you get angry, don't get angry at immigrants. If you're angry, the place to put your anger is on public officials who have set immigration numbers without regard to their effect on the American people. Now in the 90s, and let's just take one more look at this, immigration is running at more than 800,000 per year. Why are Americans so concerned about immigration today? It's because the numbers have overwhelmed them. I'm about to show you some charts that should be the centerpiece of any discussion on immigration. No congressional action should occur without consulting these charts. In 1970, we had 203 million people in this country. Those people will be represented below this chart. What this chart shows you, what this green shows you, is the growth in the U.S. population since 1970. In 1973, the American people moved to a below replacement level fertility. That means that we have on average fewer than 2.1 children per woman. At below replacement fertility, we will eventually stabilize our population along with all the rest of the advanced nations of the world. But we still had growth. This is the growth of births over deaths. And the reason is that the baby boomers, and I'm at the first of that bulge, we had to move through our childbearing years. So even though we had small families, there were so many of us that we kept growing. So in fact, this country, 30 years after it decided it had to restore and protect the environment, which added over 30 million more people that we had to deal with for air pollution, water pollution. We had to build the schools, we had to provide the infrastructure. We had a lot of population growth since 1970. Demographers have shown us what will happen to the 1970 stock population throughout the next 50 years. And that is, they took the people who were here in 1970, subtracted the deaths of those people, added their descendants, and subtracted the deaths of their descendants. And they found that this is what will happen. Now, as you can see, the population by right now is very slowly growing. In the next 5 years, it's going to stop growing. It'll grow a little bit more with the baby boom echo. And then it reaches a peak of 247 million in the year 2030. Stabilizes for some time and then starts to very slowly, imperceptibly really, to decline. This is not a zero immigration level, however. This is replacement level immigration. That is, replacement level fertility is when you have the same number of people being born as are dying each year. Replacement level immigration is when you have the same number of people coming in as leave each year. Right now, about 200,000 Americans leave the country permanently each year. This is what the Census Bureau tells us actually happened in the last 20, 25 years. Now, as you can see, our population growth has doubled over what it otherwise would have. This red represents every immigrant who came since 1970, plus their descendants, minus the deaths of both groups. There's been as much population growth from immigration as from the natural growth from the 1970 stock population. Now, that has meant that we've had to double all of the additional infrastructure expenditures we've had in this country. We've had to build twice as many schools, twice as many sewage treatment plants. We've had to build twice as many roads and streets. All of the needs of this country the additional needs of this country have doubled because of this radical new immigration policy of the United States government. In California, the State Department of Education has found that they have to build an entire elementary school every single day of the year. A new school every single day of the year in perpetuity, as long as the current immigration continues at this level, just to keep up with the children being added by immigration. So what does Congress have in store for us right now? Well, the U.S. Census Bureau tells us that if Congress does not lower the level of immigration that we have right now, we will be looking at a future that looks like this. As you can see, the numbers go completely off the charts. The Census Bureau tells us that this will be our future if immigration continues at today's rates. And this is what we're bequeathing to our children and our grandchildren by the middle of the next century. This is not conjecture, this is not subjective, this is not what might be, this is what will be if Congress refuses to lower immigration to something like a traditional level. If at this level of population, 40% of the lakes and streams in this country still are not fishable and swimmable, what are we going to do here, there, all the way up there? If Americans are beginning to fight over the opportunity to be in parks, on beaches, the national parks are being loved to death at this population in the country, what happens up here? If we are not keeping up with the education of our urban school children at this level, if we cannot build schools fast enough now, if so many Americans are feeling that the congestion and the tearing of the social fabric is moving beyond acceptability at this level, what is our hope moving on up? Now, you may live in a community that's little affected by immigration, but believe me, if this growth happens, there isn't a community in America that is assured of escaping the ravages that's now hitting California. And we must make decisions now for our children's and our grandchildren's future. If we allow this to happen, that future will be foreclosed. Now, what can we do? Very simple. Congress merely has to lower the number back to where it was in 1965, back to the golden era of immigration, below 200,000. Now, what would that look like? Well, it would not end the growth, I can tell you that. The Census Bureau says that if we were to lower immigration from the more than 1 million of today to a zero net level, which would be about 200,000, we would immediately slow the pace of growth and get some relief. The real improvement, though, would come for our grandchildren, who would see a stabilizing of the population by around 2050. The wonderful thing is that we are not way up there at almost 400 million in 2050, headed to 500 million. The bad news for us is that If you have lived in an area of high growth and you know all of the urban sprawl, all of the lost farmland, all of the drained wetlands, lost habitat, the loss of biodiversity that we've had in the last 25 years, we are going to have all of that again before we finally peak in 2050. But that's probably, I'm afraid, the best we can do. Every year we delay, the peak will be higher. There are some Americans who have very sincere feelings that we have to bring in immigrants in order to show our concern for the third world. Is immigration an effective tool? In this illustration, I use this gumball as representing about 1 million people. Now, 1 million people is about what we take in a year in immigrants. This is not a small number because remember, this one gumball worth of immigration is driving every bit of this rate. And each year, in our magnanimity, we try to rescue about this number from third world poverty. But how many people in the world are equally deserving of this kind of humanitarian concern on our part? Well, you got to have some kind of benchmark, and I use Mexico. 25% of the immigrants in the 1980s came from Mexico. Depending on the value of the peso at the time, the average Mexican makes about 1/10 the amount of money that the average American makes. That's poor. I would say that's deserving of our compassion. But how many people in the world are more impoverished than the average Mexican? And the answer is 4,600 million people. 4.6 billion people in the world are more impoverished than the average Mexican. If immigration is a policy to help the people of the third world, I want you to watch very closely. Don't miss this. Because I want you to watch and see how much the third world changes each year when we take the million people out of it. You see, there can never be any hope for the people in the third world except here where they live. Most of these people, 99 point whatever percent of these people can never leave. They're stuck where they are. They have to bloom where they're planted. If we care about these people, we have to figure out ways to help them here. Because we can do this kind of thing forever, but we won't make any difference in the world. There are many ways that Americans can help third world nations, but immigration is not one of them. And let's look at another issue here. That's the issue of the safety valve. Since the 1950s, people have been talking about how the United States has to take the overpopulation of Latin American countries, lest those countries blow up. Can that work? Well, no, it can't. Let me show you why. The fact is that last year, we took about 1 million people. But last year, the third world added births over deaths, another 80 million people into the impoverished persons of the world. And this year, we'll take 1 million people. And this year, the third world will add more than 80 million more people. And next year, if the U.S. government insists on bringing this exorbitant, non-traditional level of immigration and brings another 1 million people, these people will still add another more than 80 million people into the impoverished numbers of the world. There's no way that we can ever get ahead of this. We cannot be a safety valve. We could take millions a year, totally destroy the social fabric of this country, totally destroy the environmental resources, ruin any possibility of the lower skilled people in this country having any kind of a decent standard of living. We still would not get ahead of this. If we want to help the third world, immigration is meaningless. The most important thing we can do is answer the requests of third world nations that have been begging us for years to help them with family planning assistance. We have been enriched by so many immigrants who have brought tremendous skills into this country, and we're thankful for those. The question is, though, should we continue to drain off large numbers of skilled professional people from the other countries? Because you see, 25% of the people who come in this country are the people who could be the great agronomists, engineers, teachers, public health people, public administrators, who perhaps could do something here. If I were a person in some of those countries and had a chance to move here instead of staying here, I have no idea what I would do. This is not a moral judgment on the people who come here. It's a moral judgment on us and asking the question, do we continue to drain the most professional, brightest people from the rest of the world? Do we continue to drain the change agents? The time to act is now. Americans must contact their senators and their U.S. representatives, ask them to act immediately to bring down immigration back down to a level when immigration was a nourishing stream instead of a rampaging river.
After Earth Day 1970, during the 10-year period from 1970 to 1980, while I was in the Senate, all kinds of very important environmental legislation was passed. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Hazardous Waste Act. The dramatic increase in the population of some 70-odd million since Earth Day 1970 has made progress in cleaning up the environment difficult, if not impossible. We've made some gains, no question about that, and we've kept things from, things would have been a whole lot worse without having passed the laws that we passed, but there's no way that I can see that we can manage to preserve the integrity of the environment, the quality of life, if we continue the population growth path that we're on, bringing us to 500 million by mid-next century.
This is what America was.
But this is what America is becoming. The environmental choice is yours.
Good. Well, as you can see, it's tough stuff and it's controversial. I decided rather than me try to reproduce those numbers and throw gumballs around, I'd show you the presentation that was put together by Senator Nelson and Roy Beck, etc. I think it's very dramatic and it's very effective at making you think about it. I've studied this thing for years, and when I first saw him do that in person one time, a couple of years ago, it was very dramatic. But immigration is very complex. It gives all these dilemmas as to what we can do. And it causes people to throw around words like racism. Because if you say you're against immigration, some people say you're a racist. But the important point that I think you have to make is that you deal with the issue of not immigrants, but immigration. As Roy Hoff said, it's the numbers. A pure analysis of the numbers. To me, the only human way to approach this is to deal with our problem in a meaningful way here. And that means population and consumption and technology. We need to learn to do things in better ways, technology. We learn to consume at a much lower level, and we need to get our population stable as soon as we possibly can. And as he showed you, even if we do the best we can hope for, we're still going to double again one more time. But if we don't, we'll quadruple in the same time, quadruple in the same time. There's an article I brought along here on ethical choices, which I thought is quite interesting. It talks about the ethical choices in the world of limits about immigration. Because these things get very controversial. As some of you may know, the Sierra Club right now is involved in a big debate. Because some Sierra Club members think immigration should be considered a factor in the environment, and some say, oh no, we can't mention immigration because we'll be linked up with those people who may have ulterior reasons to oppose immigration. So this leaves us tonight, I think, with the biggest challenge facing our country. I mean, bigger challenges than World War II's and bigger challenges than going to the moon or outer space, because it's a challenge that will affect the quality of life and the sustainability of life per se in this country and in the world as we move into the 21st and 22nd century. How we can achieve a global population level that is sustainable and how we deal with the very complicated and complex political and ethical dilemmas that face us as we move into this question of population. Well, I thank you for inviting me here, and now hopefully I'd like to see some questions and comments about this issue. My question for you to start out is, how many of you have thought about this? I guess that's why you came to here. How many of you hear it talked about in your classes and at the fraternity parties and over a beer down at Mahoney's or wherever you go here at Harvard? Some? Which part? The population part or the immigration part or both? Both. Do you think Congress will act? At the moment, we in this country are at approximately 1 million legal immigrants and another 500,000 or so illegal immigrants. This whole discussion doesn't even talk about illegal immigrants. That's another whole issue which is handled in a quite different way. We're talking only about the legal immigration levels. Congress has got to make decisions. And we elect those men and women to make those decisions. Okay, who's got a comment or a question? Yes, ma'am. Why don't you come to the microphone so we all can hear you?
You can do it from your desk by just pushing the white button. Oh, underneath.
Yeah. I don't actually know specifically how population is decided, or immigration is decided on and controlled in this country. Is it voted on every year, or is it?
No, it's quite complicated. Her question is, how is immigration decided? And it's decided by Congress, and they pass a law that says we will accept so many people of different types. And historically, we had a lot of prejudices in it. You know, you had to be from Europe, etc. That was all changed, fortunately, and made it much more egalitarian. There are also the complications of allowing in some people because of refugee status. That's a very small number, and I support that. I mean, I think people who are about to be murdered or killed in their country, we should take in refugees. But that's a small number. You're talking, 50,000 or so comparatively. But the major thing that happened in 1965, when he points out the big change, was we went from a policy of accepting people based on a variety of factors to one based on what was called family reconciliation, which meant anybody who was here could bring their family. And that caused a tremendous jump, because suddenly you've got someone who immigrated here, either legally or illegally, and they say, I've got 5 brothers and sisters and 6 cousins, and I want to bring them here. And under the new law, they had first priority to come, and they could bring them. So suddenly it jumped from around 200,000 to almost 1 million, because people could bring their families if they were already here. And so Congress needs to make some changes in those rules. And it gets very emotional because, I mean, I'm sure all of you know someone who arrived last month or 1 year ago. And they're nice people. So do we want to say no to Maria, who is a good friend of ours, and she should have to go home to China or Guatemala or Peru or Indonesia? And because of that personalization of the issue, it becomes extremely difficult. And that's why I call my talk, the political and moral dilemmas of the population question. If you think abortion is sticky, immigration is almost as bad, if not worse. Yes, sir.
As a member of the Sierra Club, I'm distressed at the fact that the current debate is as contentious as it is, and it's been that way for the last couple of years. I was intrigued with the presentation and the quote from 1970 reflecting Sierra Club policy in favor of limits on immigration. Do you know when that was changed?
Yeah.
And more generally, what's your take on the current debate?
Right, I do, and I share this man's, almost pain, I think is the word, because Sierra Club is a wonderful group, and I've been a member for years. In fact, I've given talks for Sierra Club. What he's talking about, for those of you who don't know, is that Sierra Club historically, as that quote showed in 1970 and in 1980, etc., had a policy that population stabilization was a key thing to do if we're going to save the environment, which is obvious, I think, and that immigration had to be a factor. It wasn't a major issue. I mean, because Sierra Club was more involved because of their focus on wilderness and those kind of environmental issues. But in their list of things, that was listed. At a board meeting in about 1995, I believe, there was a decision made by the Sierra Club board to remove that from their list of important stuff to do. What do they call it? Their charter or their action plan. And that was passed by the board. And that was of great concern to many people, including myself and others in the Sierra Club who thought they should have left well enough alone. Now, makes this thing so crazy is if they would have left well enough alone, nothing much would have happened. Because Sierra Club is not a major population group, even though they should talk about it some, and they did. But when they took it out, it was sort of like, waving a red flag saying because we removed it, that made a big issue out of it. So a number of Sierra Club people circulated a petition saying we want it back in again. And there's now a vote going on right now. Every Sierra Club member is voting right now as to whether they want to put it back in or not. And there's been all kinds of bitter stuff going on that you don't want to hear about. It's like a family battle at Thanksgiving over everybody's in-laws come and everybody squabbles over it. It's very sad what's going on. But it was caused by a few board members back a few years ago who wanted to remove it because of what some people would call, I've forgotten the term for it. What's the proper term of you have to be proper?
Politically correct.
What?
Politically correct.
Political correctness, yeah. Political correctness that would sweep across this country, and I believe in political correctness, I guess, but it became sort of carried away in many regards. And one of them was this attitude of not wanting to mention immigration because it might offend someone who either was an immigrant or knew an immigrant etc. So that's kind of the Sierra Club unfortunate situation that's going on right now. But I think some people think it's going to be okay because it has forced us to deal with an issue which no one wanted to deal with, including Sierra Club. So maybe out of this, the good news may be Sierra Club will heal. I honestly hope it goes back in again, and then we can kind of move on. But I'm not sure what's going to happen. If it doesn't go back in again, it's going to be worse because I think a majority of Sierra Club members think it should be there, even though some of the leadership doesn't. And then you're going to have this continual battle. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about the fertility rate among the immigrant.
The what rate?
Fertility among the immigrant. It was like when he did that presentation, I missed how he figured what the fertility rate would be and how confident are we of that?
The question is, what is fertility rate? And to put those numbers together, the U.S. Census Bureau looks at the fertility rate of immigrants, which is higher than the average fertility rate of non-immigrants. So the increase includes immigrants and their descendants, and their fertility rate is higher. U.S. non-immigrant fertility rate is approximately a replacement level, as he indicated. In Europe, fertility rate is now below replacement level. In a number of countries now, population actually is decreasing slightly. And the magic number is about 2, as you probably can imagine. It kind of makes sense. 2 people have babies, and 2 babies is replacing them. In some places like Italy and France and Spain, it's as low as 1.5, 1.6, places numbers like that. There's actually some political concern, which really makes me smile in some ways, that they need to encourage more children in those countries because they're worried about there's only one issue. I have a friend that said this years ago, and I've said it myself occasionally to challenge an audience. He says, I challenge you to name one issue we face, one problem, that will be made better or easier to solve if we double the population. And of course, people can't think of one, congestion, air pollution, etc. But there is one you might talk about, and that's the so-called Social Security problem. The fact that by the time you kids, I'm joking, get to be 65, there's not going to be enough people making money to pay the taxes to support you. That's this great crisis in Social Security. And the solution to it is we need to have more children and more immigrants, so there'll be a lot of people in the labor pool paying taxes to support you and you and you when you retire. Well, that's the biggest Ponzi scheme in history. You know what that is, right? A Ponzi scheme, I mean, how long can you continue? At what level of population do you finally decide that the environment has gone totally to hell as you try to produce more and more workers to pay into Social Security to support retirees? There are other ways to solve the Social Security problem, which may be politically difficult. And as someone who is an elected politician, I have to deal with it, and I have some ideas about that for another talk someday. But the way to solve the Social Security problem is not to encourage more babies who will therefore be able to produce the money to pay for the Social Security payments of retiring people. So in Europe, the population is quite stable and going down in some areas. If we could, I mean, this is very complicated because we have to deal with a situation where much of the world needs to improve the standard of living quite a bit, and they need to have their fertility lowered substantially. There's real progress made. Thailand is a real success story because the king and a lot of leadership put it, and they dropped their population fertility from in the 5 and 6 down to 2 to 3 in a short time. So you can do it if you're willing to have the resources and the education and the leadership. They need to have a standard of living raised closer to what we have. We need to lower our standard of living measured in, automobiles and VCRs and garbage disposals, and our standard of living improved in terms of the lack of traffic jams and the wilderness areas we can go hiking in. And we need to have the population of this country stable and the population of the rest of the world stable at some level, according to David Pimentel, of around 2 billion people. So we do need to have a reducing population for probably 2 generations. Now, can all this happen? What do you think? You're the future generations out there. Some of you, I see a couple of people, gray hairs in the audience like me, but some of you young folks, what do you think? I know you're a member of the environmental group here. Tough battle. How can we get Americans or other people to deal with it? I've been struggling with this now for a number of years. I need some help from you. What?
Have them go hungry. Have them suffer.
Yeah, but that's not easy.
I know.
I seem to remember a couple of years ago reading an article in Foreign Relations by one of the ministers, I think, in the Japanese finance ministry, who said that a lot of the problems related to anthropocentrism. And your talk is about the moral and political implications of things like biodiversity, which is probably the single most urgent, ecological problem facing us today. Is the question of anthropocentrism too strong for Americans to face up to today?
Yeah, I don't know. It's amazing. I gave a speech to a lot of high school biology students in Florida a few months ago. I was down in Florida for a meeting of a global environmental thing I'm on the board of, and a friend of mine said, hey, would you come talk to classes? So I said, okay, I'd do it. Boy, that's tough stuff. 5 in a row, one day, an hour each with about 40 high school students. But I brought up this issue, not quite in this depth, but alluded to it in my IPAT equation kind of stuff. It was an interesting reaction. It ranged from people who really agreed to a standard, oh, you can't tell me how many kids I want to have, to one young woman, these are high school kids, and they were sincere. She said, no, she said we should limit older people from living rather than stop people from having babies. So she said she'd be in favor of just eliminating all medical care for people over 50 or so and solve it that way. And we got into a little discussion where I said, gee, I have trouble with that, but it was a very interesting experience for me to deal with approximately, say, 150 high school students within a day in 5 classes, gingerly around this subject and have their reactions and comments. But some of it was encouraging, some of it was sort of discouraging. Yeah?
I was recently accessed the website of the Zero Population.
You're not using your microphone, I don't think.
I recently accessed the website of the Zero Population Growth chapter of Boston, and they have a lot of materials for promoting, doing demonstrations and ideas for that kind of thing. And one of their They suggest putting up a banner over an overpass that says if there were fewer people, you'd be home by now. And, just, I don't know, it seemed kind of radical, but the idea of you can mobilize people when they can see how things can really affect their day-to-day lives,
Yeah, I mean, 25 years ago when I first started this, I used to say we should hand out ZPG literature in line. I mean, go anywhere where there's a line of people and give out literature about population, or in traffic jams, when the cars are going slow enough that you can walk by them, you should give out material. But I don't know. I mean, that wouldn't hurt. but I don't know how you can get to enough people. Remember early in my talk, I talked about the backlash. Remember? We're in the backlash now. There's a lot of powerful interests, economic, religious, who think what I've just said is heresy. And how to overcome that powerful economic equals political in today's world, because politics is pure money. I mean, I hate to be so honest about it, but that's what it's about. We had a special election in Wisconsin a couple weeks ago for a state senator who had been appointed to a federal judgeship, so it was an open seat. And both candidates spent over $250,000 for a little dinky state senate seat. When I was first elected to a state senator a number of years ago, I spent about $6,000. That was 20 years ago. But recently, state senate races have spent $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. In this special election, both candidates spent over $250,000 for a state senate race. In California, a recent senate race, candidates spent $20 and $30 million each. So how do you overcome the economic, equal political, and the religious? And I urge you all to get a copy of this article by Dr. Mumford on the life and death of NSS 200 and why that report was classified for 14 years and never, how can you, I get so frustrated. How can you read the Rockefeller Commission report of 1972 or the Nixon-Ford report of a few years later? And we've just ignored it. We've just sailed on as if there was no population problem for 30 years, which is why I decided about a year or so ago when I was at Cornell and David Pimentel and I were having lunch together, we decided to initiate this idea of a U.S. population policy. So we've got a 6-person committee and 20-some advisors and 40 group co-sponsoring the idea of trying to raise the issue in this country of a U.S. population policy or lack of it and what we should do about it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you've just been doing this for a year, because I was becoming awfully depressed thinking you've been trying to do this for 20 years and the issue it's not on the screen as far as I can tell. I'm wondering, first of all, I'm from Indiana and Minnesota most recently, so I wonder how this issue plays at home, or if you do play it at home, and just what is the strategy of the group to try to get the message out more widely?
I don't know. I mean, it plays about the same. In Wisconsin, you don't hear about it. The article from the Milwaukee paper, all about the destruction of all the lakes in Wisconsin, all the building, all the development. In Madison, there's a major fight now about two Beltline freeways around the city of Madison. And population doesn't get mentioned in those debates very often. You very rarely see it. Professor Mike Mahler, I believe, I've got a reference if you want it, from Louisiana State University, a professor of journalism, has written a very interesting article maybe 6 months ago on the topic of why population is never in the media. And he as a journalist professor, kind of approach to looking at it. Interesting conclusions, but it's not there. It's probably editors, it's probably the fear of offending someone. Politics, if you mention birth control or abortion or immigration, you offend someone, and editors don't want to offend people, so they tell their reporters either not to write about it, or if they do write about it, they edit out population discussion within environmental articles. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in your work in the new group you've organized. In the context of zero population growth and other nonprofits involved in that sort of advocacy, can you critique those groups and their effectiveness and kind of put what you're doing in the context of what they're doing?
What groups are the better? ZPG, I'm kind of put out with at the moment because they're sort of adopting a limiting growth approach rather than population stabilization. I think MPG is a better group. They run big full-page ad in the newspapers quite often, so I think MPG is a much better group. Another group called CCN, Carrying Capacity Network, is quite a good group, in my opinion. I think those are the two best that are population-related. Within the classical environmental groups, the Wilderness Society has got a good position, but they don't do much. The Audubon Society is very careful about it, but they actually have a nationwide population and habitat program where they are spending a lot of money and have hired about a dozen people to talk about the issue of population and habitat. They do that to be careful. But of course, we all know that what causes the birds to go away is that we're cutting down the birds' trees, and that's population. So Audubon is doing pretty good. I urge you to support Audubon and help them keep their neck out there, because there's a lot of people, like within Sierra Club, that think Audubon should be quiet and not mention population. But they are doing it, and I think that's a positive thing to see. The biggest problem is Congress and our political leaders. I mean, they're such total wimps and so afraid of any one issue, like the court abortion issue or the immigration issue, they won't deal with it. Another problem is that when you get into the immigration issue, you find some strange and unsavory bedfellow, you can't say bedfellow, bedpersons. Got to be politically correct. I was at a meeting in Denver about a year or so ago. I was a speaker and other people were there. Gildo Nelson was there. And during the luncheon of that event, which were mostly people who were there who were concerned about it. So it was a true believers group. A lot of really good people there. I sat down to lunch, and a woman sitting next to me, and I hadn't met her yet, and we just started chatting. And before long, she started saying things like, we got to limit immigration to keep those people out, to keep them out, to keep them, those, them. Well, as you can tell, I'm not afraid of controversy, so I probed her a minute. I said, what do you mean? And she immediately started talking about those black and brown people, etc. So I got up and left. I mean, I picked my lunch up and went to the table and let her sit there by herself. She is probably a bit of a racist. And she believes in limiting immigration for her own, what I would call, despicable reasons. But any movement will attract sort of fellow travelers that may agree with your purpose, but have reasons that you do not respect. But that fear is what's driving the Sierra Club and other groups to be afraid to talk about immigration, because there are some very unsavory people out there who are opposed to more immigration for reasons that I don't respect a bit. But certainly people like Gildo Nelson, and I hope me and others, are certainly not racist, but have to begin to question this issue. The first politician ever to do it was Governor Lamb, Dick Lamb of Colorado, 20 years ago. And he got all kinds of crap thrown at him when, as governor of Colorado, he began to talk about the fact that we need to limit growth of Colorado. He fought to keep the Olympics out of Colorado because it was going to cause a big growth. And he began to say, we need to begin to question how many immigrants we should allow in. And it was very controversial when he first started saying that 20 years ago. Well, I think my time is well up, and you're standing up, which means I probably should try to get the audience to stop here. I did bring a lot of handout material. I don't want to lug it home, so if you'll use it effectively and give it to people, there's a number of good articles here, and then these are the one by Stephen Mumford, and I've got a few copies of my book. If any of you are interested in contributing to the Wisconsin Environmental Decade, you can have one of those. And I'll be around here for a few minutes to talk about this material and answer questions. And again, I thank you for inviting me to be part of your Harvard Earth Day celebration.
Thank you very much.
I thought about when the young people, the students invited me to come do this.